Welcome to this particular screencast on policy stock issues and a few other tidbits as we go through. What we're going to do in this lecture is talk a little bit about the background you need to know about developing policy arguments, and then we'll talk, of course, about the stock issues involved in doing so. So to jump right into things, some important terms you need to know first off would be systems perspectives, needs analysis, and comparative advantages. The systems perspective is essentially the communication theory put forward saying that everything is connected. It kind of reminds us a little bit of our discussions on value stock issues, where if you shift the hierarchy of one of your values, it naturally shifts the hierarchies related with everything else. So the same thing happens here, because policy arguments are all about policy or law changes. So these are about laws shifting, new policies or rules being built. It's all about the word should. So a systems perspective says whenever you should something, whenever you say that something should or should not be the way it is, you have to think about the trickle-down effect and how that particular perspective is going to impact everything else. For example, let's say that I wanted to change the parking situation at my local university, and therefore I say that this parking should be increased. That's nice and easy for me to say, but what happens when I say that? There's money involved. There are people, administration, architects, construction workers. Whenever we had a parking garage put on campus 5 or 10 years ago, it took over 2.5, 3 years to build and closed down 4 different parking lots and even had a no walking zone around it where you would get a $100 ticket if you walked there. So there's a lot more involved than just, hey presto, parking. So whenever you think something, especially if you're an advocate, if you're pushing for change in a policy argument, you have to keep in your mind that anything that you propose is going to have a rippling out effect, which could potentially impact the efficacy or impact of your argument. It's so easy to say that something should be different. It is completely another beast to look through what will happen once that difference is made. Now, opponents who are defending the present system should also be aware of this, because if you're proposing that something should defend the way it is or stay the way it is, then that has results too. If you think of businesses in the area, there are some businesses that have gone out of business because they didn't keep up with the times. They kept with things the way they were and they didn't change and they didn't update. Therefore, the business was lost. There are other businesses who have changed with the times and altered their ways from when they were first brought into being, and therefore they've been able to maintain. So change or no change is going to have consequences. So the systems perspective says that everything is an interrelated component in a system, and changing one component will necessarily impact the other components as well. So please think it through. If there's anything I can say here, it is think it through. Now, the next 2 terms you need to know are essentially 2 different ways that you can build a policy case. The first of these is a needs analysis, and this means that you argue from the perspective of the needs of the current system. Your whole argument is geared towards proving to me that change needs to happen, that there are needs or situations of lacking in the way things currently are. So you analyze the needs of the current system, and your whole argument is based off of representing and proving that those needs are there. So to go back to my example of parking, I would have to do a needs analysis and examine what needs to change. Do we need more parking, or do we just need closer parking? Is it primarily student parking, or is it faculty or carpool? Is it handicapped? Do we need to split it by what year of student you are, senior through freshman? Is it something where it's just the type of car you bring to campus? So on and so forth. So I would have to look at how parking as a whole is currently handled, and then I would analyze the needs or the gaps in that particular system, and my argument would be focused on explaining what those needs are and proving that they are in existence. The comparative advantages case is when your entire argument is geared towards comparing the advantages of different systems. So I have my current system and I compare it to a new proposed system, because each system has some level of advantage associated with it. So what I would essentially be doing is saying, here's what's good about the parking situation we currently have. However, if we get a new parking situation, here are the benefits that would come with that. So it's like a needs analysis in that you are, looking at the needs, but you are more focused on showing the good. Instead of the negative and the problems and the lacking, you are focused on comparing what we have with what we could have. And generally this is done with a focus on replacing the current system, saying, yes, right now we have ample parking, but it isn't conveniently located. Therefore, this new system would have fewer spots, but they would be closer to the relevant buildings. So a comparative advantages case, it compares the advantage of the current to the new. So to move on, see, easy lecture here. We're moving right into policy stock issues. And if you're in one of my classes and not just finding this on YouTube before a test, congratulations, this is your final set. You should be happy that it is almost over. So there are 4 stock issues of policy. And the first one of those is the stock issue of ill. I know that just looks like 3 little check marks there, but welcome to the glory of font. So this is the ill, as in the sickness. So the ill is defined as the problem you face in an argument. So it is the issue with the current system. If you're an advocate, you would generally be pushing for this ill to be fixed in some way. If you're an opponent, you're probably arguing that there isn't really a problem and that the problem or ill rests on the advocate's shoulders because they're the ones who want to needlessly shake something up. So the ill is the problem with the way things are. The first point underneath that is the quality of the ill, and the quality is defined as the intensity of the problem, essentially how big of an issue this is, why is it worth our time. If you've noticed this theme, all different types of argument have this built in there some way. At some point in any argument you're going to give, you are going to tell me why this is worth my time. So, next thing that we would have would be the quantity, and this is essentially a breakdown of who and or what is impacted by the scope of this argument. So who is going to be affected? What is going to be effective? And I encourage you to be creative here because this could include things like time and money and inconvenience. It's not just as simple as faculty and asphalt, okay? So be creative here because you do need to make sure that in the ill stock issue you have a clear explanation of what the problem is, how intensive a problem it is, and definitely who and what is going to be involved in the solution or the problem here. We need to know who this is impacting. This is why news stories, instead of just saying power outages, will say 15 million people impacted by power outages because that makes it a lot more impactful than just somebody lost electricity. In the blame stock issue, this is the fun one. We enjoyed this one because this is where we get to point the finger. The blame stock issue is where we identify the root cause of the ill. So where did that ill come from? And in this stock issue, you should be laying responsibility for the problem on something or someone. And there are 2 different types of blame that you will encounter. There's structural blame and there is attitudinal blame. Structural blame is when there is a physical, measurable issue that's causing the problem. So there's something that I can go out and see, count, touch, and measure, and that is what is causing the ill. An attitudinal blame is when it is more in the values, beliefs, or ideas of a person, and that's what's causing the issue. You can't really whip out a measuring tape and measure somebody's belief or convictions, so it's a different type of blame. So an attitudinal blame is something that rests in someone's values and beliefs and behaviors, while a structural blame is something physical, countable, quantifiable, measurable. Don't worry, I'll be giving you an argument example here in just a minute, so we will get there. I have a cat in the background, so if you hear it, I apologize. So the cure stock issue is where we finally get around to resolving the ill. This is where you put forth a proposal of how this issue is going to be resolved. And you should be as specific here as is humanly possible. This is where your research should really come to the fore. And that research will hit in the plan of action. Now, you clearly could use research in the ill and the blame because you need to research the specifics of the problem and also the root cause of the problem, but you'll probably have even more resources here where you identify a step-by-step plan of how you plan on curing the ill. It's all nice and easy to say, build a parking garage, but we all know it's not that simple. You have to find the space. You have to have architectural drawings mocked up. You have to make sure that there are enough people to support it. You have to make sure you have money. Administration has to approve it. The city permits have to be gained. There have to be surveys. There's just so much that goes into that simple proposition of add a parking garage. So the cure is where you really should break down, again, step by step solution to the problem, as detailed and as specific as you reasonably can be. When I say reasonable, I don't mean that you have to count how many bricks it would be necessary to build a parking garage. That's a little bit over the top. But I do mean that you need to be able to be aware of all the steps that should be in place to make any type of change happen. If you're vague in this stock issue, you are opening yourself up for absolute destruction by your opponent. Because if your cure is really just broad and vague, all your opponent has to do is say, well, how are you going to do that? And if you don't have an answer, the entirety of your case falls apart and you lose the debate. So the more specific you can be here, again, reasonably specific, the better. The last stock issue is the cost-benefit stock issue. And what happens in this particular stock issue is that you identify the ugly, so that's the cost, and you identify the gorgeous, those are the benefits. 2 notes here. 1, please keep them in this order. Cost should come first and then benefits. Why? Because the last thing we hear you say before you hit into a conclusion should be positive. If the last thing we hear you say is, and that will cost you $10 million, we're not really going to vote for you. So costs should come first and then benefits. That's your speaking order. Secondly would be to be honest here. Do not hide the costs of your plan. If you hide or lie about the actual costs of your plan of action, your opponents can very easily discover that and then use that to absolutely obliterate you in the debate setting. So if it costs $10 million, it costs $10 million. Your plan of action should accommodate for where that money is going to come from. So if you've done a good job, you've already got a plan in place for how that will happen. So costs should be honest and they should be first. Benefits should also be honest and they should be last. Your benefits should be an honest representation of the advantages which will be gained by your proposed cure. Those benefits, again, have to be reasonable. You can't sit here and finish off with, and the world will be a better place. Well, it very well might be, but that's a little bit broad and vague and exaggerated. We can't just assume that unicorns are going to sprout up from the ground if this happens. So your benefits have to be reasonable, measurable benefits that people can relate to. Especially if your plan's going to take a few years, you have to identify something that we're going to benefit from immediately and then some long-term benefits as well. So for an example of an argument, we're going to do something a little bit less serious than the examples I typically use in class, and we're going to do something relatively broad. That's just going to be wearing hats should be mandatory. Now, back in the olden days of America, everybody, man, woman, whatever you might want to be, who, child, adults, everybody had some type of head covering on. And this goes back all the way to colonial times where women wore these things called mob caps. And men, of course, had different types of hat. Everyone always had their head covered. And, of course, through like the 1950s and 60s, that continued. But about in the 60s, that's when that petered off and hats no longer became mandatory. And as you might imagine, eyesight and skin issues came right there with it because of the effects of the sun. So what we're going to do is have the rather ridiculous proposition that wearing hats should be mandatory. For my ill, I'm going to say that the lack of hat wearing is resulting in skin and eye issues. Of course, I would be more specific in that in a 7-minute argument and explain specifically which skin and eye problems. And I would tell you that the quality is intense due to the severity of health concerns that can come from skin and eye issues due to sun exposure. And I pretty much would apply this to anybody that has skin or eyes, therefore humanity. And again, I might want to limit it to humanity because technically all kinds of animals have skin and eyes as well, and I would love to see someone try to strap a hat on one of my cats. The blame stock issue, I would just blame it on anybody who chooses not to wear a hat. So if someone's choosing not to wear a hat, it's their problem. So pop quiz question before I move on, is this a structural or an attitudinal blame? Since it is a personal choice, it is technically attitudinal. But a note I'm going to give you here about blame is that not all arguments are going to have both types of blame. This argument does not technically have a structural, physical, measurable blame. I could possibly bring in some statistics about how many people wear hats regularly versus how many of those do not, and I could make it a structural blame, but really the root cause of the ill is a personal choice. So that is more attitudinal. If I wanted to get super creative and bring socioeconomic status and the affordability of hats in, then I could turn it into a structural argument as well. So something to put in your notes for blame is that arguments could have one type of blame or both. They do not necessarily always have both. So some arguments will just have attitudinal blames, some arguments will just have structural blames, and some will have both. I say do whatever you can effectively manage. So if my blame is those who choose not to wear hats and it's an attitudinal blame because it's a personal choice, again, I can stretch it and say that I can bring in socioeconomic status and affordability to make it structural. But for the sake of simplicity and singularity of focus, we'll just keep it on attitudinal. Then I would have a cure, so I'd have a conditional law requiring hats to be worn outdoors, and what I would do in my plan of action is kind of break down what I mean by conditional, because conditional law would mean that you can't force everyone in all of humanity to wear hats, but can we make them more affordable? Can we provide more marketing out there to inform people's attitudes on why hat wearing is necessary? Sure. So a conditional law would mean there would probably not be any type of truly negative consequence for not wearing one, but we could try to make something more mandatory to protect people's skin and eye issues. So that plan of action would go through probably the steps of law. So it could be a petition, design of legislation that have to be voted on, put into there, some type of enforcement. Again, we probably wouldn't want to fine people for not wearing a hat, but there would be some way of regulating it and making it occur. For the costs and benefits, a couple of things that would be worth knowing here is that, of course, any type of lawmaking is going to take time, it's going to take money, and we might be removing some level of personal choice about how you choose to cover your skin and eyes. But the benefits of this particular argument would be that you're going to have health, better skin, better eyesight, and when I say all that comes with it, think of something like insurance costs. Do you have any idea how much money we spend on dermatologists, ophthalmologists, and optometrists every year? And a significant amount of those costs are due to sun exposure. So you could be saving money, you could have better health, you could have lower health insurance premiums. There are all kinds of ripple effect benefits from this particular argument. So in summary, whenever you argue with policy, keep in mind whatever you're going to recommend is going to ripple out and affect a lot more than you might originally think about. Your proposition should include the word should, and you're going to have 4 stock issues that walk us through the natural problem-solving process of identifying the problem, identifying the root cause, finding a way to solve it, and then weighing the good, the bad, and the ugly of our solution. So in 18 minutes, you should be ready to rock when it comes to policy stock issues. I appreciate your time. Have a wonderful day.